Welcome to Lynn Cullen Live, talk radio without the static. Email your questions and comments to lynn@pghcitypaper.com. And now your host, Lynn Cullen.
Did somebody say my name? I heard it. Hello, how you doing? And welcome to 30 days, half September, April, June, the penultimate day of May. Right? That's correct. That means the 30th. I'm still a little jet lagged and or messed up, and so you'll forgive me. Also, you'll forgive not me, but you don't have to. Apparently, our Skype is not able to get up, and that means we can't take your calls today, which leaves you with moi, just me. But last we met, Bob Mueller was striding to the podium over there at the Department of Justice for what was, a 10-minute, unsatisfying rendition of the final words he wants to say about his 2-year probe. I just want to say I found it extremely unsatisfying. This, sort of lawyerly, gingerly, it drives me crazy. The New York Times today, in its editorial, translated parts of his speech into everyday English, which is why the hell he couldn't just talk in a manner that was more clear. And it's driving a lot of us crazy, his sort of inability to be more direct. The most direct he was saying, if we had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so. Now, if he delivered that line like I just did, it would have had an impact, more of an impact. But it turns out Robert Mueller is a very smart, honorable man, but he can't read out loud. Did you hear? I mean, he was stumbling through that thing like, it drove me crazy, and there was like no affect. It was just blah, 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 blah. So he would have said this: if we had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so. And by that time, you were asleep. God. So, however, the New York Times points out, and this shows how totally jaded we've become, how inured to the daily horrors and I can't think of that word. I wanted to say trepidations, but that's not right. What's going on every day? Like the president had a meltdown in the White House driveway this morning. That gets your attention for 2 seconds, and we're going to move on to something he's going to tweet maybe right now, right? So it's nice to have a reporter say this. Although it lasted less than 10 minutes, the news conference presented an extraordinary spectacle of a top federal law enforcement official publicly stating that the president's conduct had warranted criminal investigation. In any other presidency, such a thing would have been huge. And you saw my reaction to it. Why couldn't Mueller have talked more forcefully? No, everything is just lost now. The American people, I had a woman tell me yesterday, if I hear Mueller report one more time, I'm going to lose my mind. People are, and this is what Nancy Pelosi knows. Most Americans are not following this like you news junkies are. Most Americans have tuned out long ago, probably, which suggests that they are at least emotionally intelligent and are engaging in self-care. Because to stay in the game and keep paying attention is not only enervating, it is ultimately, what good does it do you? I don't know. Gail Collins, who reacted like I did, said, if Mueller's speech had been accompanied by English subtitles, they would have said something like, look, the guy obstructed justice, but you can't charge a president with a crime while he's in office, so you're going to have to impeach him first. That is what he said. That's also what his report said, quite clearly. So it's back to the Democrats in the House, because that's their job if there's to be an impeachment. And Nancy Pelosi, I think I had a quote from Nancy Pelosi somewhere in here. Nancy Pelosi, who was in San Francisco, speaking at the conference, isn't it either, said that she wants to stay right where she has been, which is gathering more evidence. And she says we do want to make such a compelling case, such an ironclad case, that even the Republican Senate, which at the time seems not to be an objective jury, even the Republican Senate will be convinced of the path we have to take as a country. Now, that is arguably a very wise way to proceed. Cautiously, carefully, and getting to the point where if the Republicans don't or are not going to convict, it will become rather clear to Americans that they are putting party over the country. I don't know. I would imagine Mueller will unhappily find himself testifying before the House, at least, and probably not in public session. That would be my guess. Hang on a minute here. Roger writes, late in yesterday's show, you talked about liberals being wimps, not tough enough to fight back. Roger then asks the existential question, have I become a wimp or just tired? Perhaps I've just fallen into despair, to be more accurate. None of this is taking into account the no-impact Mueller report. He's talking about for years. What? Roger, you're starting to lose it, buddy. I suggest back away from your information sources and take a break, really. He says, despair. Is this what Eastern Europeans have fallen into after being shit on for centuries? They've got their vodka. We have our opioids. Is it come to that? Maybe liberals becoming militant and weaponizing our cause is the way to go. United Shades of America on CNN did a show on such people. This gave me mixed feelings of being energized and waiting to sign up, but also sadness. What a wimp. He's talking about himself. So when I was getting dressed today, I was looking in the mirror because, I was putting on makeup. I was looking in the mirror, and I saw there were spots all over this thing I'd put on, and I thought, maybe it's water spots, like I was brushing my teeth and maybe whatever. And so I'm carefully, and I know these are going to move, so I thought if you can possibly see the spots, I better just own up. I am wearing a totally stained shirt. And you know what? This is making me hot, so I'm going to take it off. I'm sweating. Here is the story I woke up to today that so appalled me. You know, you think we're at a stage where you can't be appalled anymore? Really. You know, it's just like, yeah, whatever. But this from the, I guess it says here the Wall Street Journal broke it. I didn't see it in the Journal. I saw it in the Washington Post. Listen to this. A senior Navy official has confirmed that someone at the White House sent a message to the military folks in Tokyo. You know, the president was just there, requesting that while the president was there, the USS John McCain be kept out of the picture. Photographs of a tarp obscuring the McCain name on the ship were published. When senior Navy officials, it said, grasped what was happening, they directed Navy personnel to stop, and the tarp was removed on Saturday. The crew of the McCain was also not invited to any of the activities that happened. The crew, in fact, was released from duty for a long holiday weekend. A senior White House official also confirmed that they did not want the destroyer with the McCain name seen in any photographs. Speaking on condition of anonymity, he said the president was not involved in this planning, but the request had been made to keep the president from being upset. Now, I'm sorry. I'm upset. We've got a guy in the White House with his finger on, the nuclear annihilation button, who his staff has to run out in advance of and remove anything that might trigger him, like the name of one of America's ships in Tokyo's harbor. Of course, Trump is denying it. Says here, though, in the Washington Post, the U.S. Navy reportedly went to great lengths to shield Trump from seeing the ship. They first covered it with a tarp, then used a barge to block the name, and gave sailors the day off. There's a lot of denial going on coming from the acting, he is still acting, right? Acting Secretary of Defense. Isn't that amazing? People close to the president knowing that if he were to see John McCain's name on this big ship, that it would set him off. And they, having to be around him, know how quickly and how triggered he is by the smallest little stuff. And McCain must be like one of the biggest triggers. Must be, clearly. He has no control. McCain's longtime speechwriter tweeted this. He's so incensed. Perhaps the late senators, McCain's his Armed Services Committee colleagues, will have questions about this for the acting Secretary of Defense, whose confirmation ought to be in jeopardy. to me, this sums it up. I saw just a little bit of Trump in the driveway this morning. We got a president, guys, who is mentally unfit, emotionally unfit, who Meghan McCain, who I wish she would shut up too, called, again, responding to all of this, a child. And of course, it's worse than a child because it's a messed up child. I mean, he's not even a healthy child emotionally. And so she wrote, I can't find it. I'm sorry. But she wrote that he was, come on, Megan, where's your stuff? Here it is. Trump is a child who will always be deeply threatened by the greatness of my dad's incredible life. That is true. But it shows how bizarre Trump is, that he's the one who keeps calling attention to John McCain, and thus a contrast, making the contrast apparent between our sense and knowledge of who John McCain was and Trump. Why? It shows he is unstable. Any of us who would have such an animosity toward someone who we knew that almost universally everyone else respected, and who in fact is now dead, you would shut up. You wouldn't bring it up. And Trump is incapable of that level of self-control. And she says, Trump will not let my father rest in peace. And it's true. And she says, I'm being criticized for talking too much about my father, but I'm talking about him because I'm always defending his name, his reputation, his honor. Because this child, this troubled, awful child in the White House keeps dragging him out of his grave and into the public sphere again. Wow, is all I have to say. Just wow. Here is some good news. And anytime I see the name Benjamin Netanyahu as he's the subject of this sentence, and the verb is suffered, and the next words are a stunning defeat. Benjamin Netanyahu suffered a stunning defeat. Yes. Unbelievable. So he won the election, but it's a parliamentary system. He didn't win a clear majority, his party, so he had to create a coalition government, which is what inevitably happens in the raucousness of Israeli politics. And he couldn't do it. And this is the first time in Israel's history that a prime minister has been unable to cobble together a governing majority. So, it's a parliamentary system. They got to have another election. That election will be in September. And I have no idea the odds of how one can move what was a close election, move it in such a way that Netanyahu will, in fact, be truly defeated. But at least there's a reprieve here. There's a 3-month period when, I don't know, if the opposition, which easily accounts for half of the Israeli citizenry, easily. And especially if Israeli Arabs vote. A lot of Israeli Arabs do not use their franchise because, for principled reasons, to do so would be acknowledging somehow. It makes no sense. The Israeli citizens who are Arabs, I don't think I'm wrong about this, I think if they would vote in more numbers could take him out. Anyway, that was the best news yesterday, without a doubt. You know, I saw this in the Wall Street Journal, and I yawned. This was a few days ago. It was a front page story on how increasingly police all over the country are setting up special units. These are not SWAT units. This is not as sexy a deployment to get if you're a cop. But what it is, they've got special units all over the country now to spot people who are driving in HOV lanes with dummies sitting in the passenger seat. Apparently, and I did not know that this is happening to such an extent now that there has to be a crackdown. And they're cracking down everywhere. Several states, including New York, California, Florida, they have dedicated police units that are there to only see dummies in cars whizzing by. Now, I laughed when I saw this because the first time I ever heard the term HOV lane was back in the 80s. I think the early 80s it would have been. I was relatively new to Pittsburgh. I was a TV reporter. And we were putting in our first HOV lane on 279. And that was a big story, HOV lanes. And the news was full of what that meant, high occupancy vehicle. And that you had to have, I think it was at least one more person. Although initially I think it might have been you had to have two more. I'm not sure. And I remember thinking, well, that's easy to get around. And I did a piece for Channel 4's news showing how people could get on the HOV lane without another human being in their car. And what I did was I went downtown to Liberty Avenue, which at the time was a pretty disreputable part of downtown with strip clubs and all kinds of stuff that I guess respectable people do not go to. And I walked into a shop that sold sex items. And I bought a blow-up, I don't know what you call those things, sex doll? I'd never seen one. It was the most disgusting thing imaginable. You cannot imagine. So I blew her up, and she had a mouth that was like this. She had other in places. She was, and I blew her up, and I gave her some clothes. I gave her a little hat, and I put her in I think I put her in the back seat. And then I borrowed a friend's dog, an Afghan. Have you ever looked at an Afghan dog from behind? It looks like some tall babe with like flowing hair. So I stuck the dog in the passenger seat. I might get this wrong, and the porn doll in the back, or vice versa. And I got a camera crew, and I breezed onto the newly opened HOV lane, and up and down 279 I went with my porn doll and the dog. And I mean, it was just meant to show how easily gotten around this was. So that was in 1981. I have to tell you, hello, I figured that out. And here, 30 years later, almost, yeah. In fact, California Highway Patrol has signs up saying, "Don't be a dummy. Follow the rules." There is nothing in this report that anybody had, employed an Afghan, though. I mean, I had the Afghan and the porn doll. They say people are using blow-up sex dolls, mannequins, skeletons. Well, that would attract attention, a skeleton. And in fact, Washington State is weighing a bill to raise penalties for people trying to get around the regulations of their HOV lanes. But when I saw that article, it brought back that I completely had forgotten about doing that. And I mean, the creepiest thing about it was the sex doll. I had never, wow. And, that Stretch of Liberty is now part of the cultural district. And it shows how things change over time. You couldn't find that sex doll where I found her now to save your life. Little Tony writes, the White House staff know that they are working for an unstable snowflake. Snowflake is too nice a term for him, Tony. They were trying to prevent a bad reaction from Trump, and it backfired on him. Trump will probably give them a pat on the back when he gets back. No, he won't, because ultimately it made him look bad. I don't think so. Although he doesn't seem bothered by it because he tweeted about it. He lied, as he always says. He says, I did not. Well, no, maybe he didn't order it. It's people around him knowing to get that out of his sight because he'll freak. As a side note, I wanted to tell you that the last 2 days your audio levels are much improved. Amy, my producer, says, not doing anything different. We don't have a clue. P.S. Who picks up all those papers you throw on the floor? Who says they're on the floor? Oh, that one did. There's a recycle can right there. I'm almost always. That last one was the only one I've. Oh, geez. Okay, so now I'm missing. Sometimes I do. Noreen writes, hi, Lynn. I wonder if a pregnant woman driving in an... I love this. Noreen, yes. I wonder if a pregnant woman driving in an HOV lane in one of those, southern states or any state that says that a fetus is a human being with all the rights of, none of the responsibilities, I might add, all of the rights that accrue to us other human beings. Yeah, she said, I wonder if a pregnant woman driving in an HOV lane could claim 2 people in the car and get away with it. That is great. It almost makes you wanna find a pregnant woman in one of the states that are actually arresting people for this, who also see fetuses as having the rights of a fully, viable person. Wouldn't that be a great case that would, well, I don't know. I mean, get on it, Noreen. Get to work. That is too wonderful. That is just wonderful. Okay. I have to tell you, I'm sorry, and this is what happens when you can't get calls. Your emails have been wonderful, but I think that what we're going to have to do here is I had intended. Let me try one more time just to see, because I got to get my average up today. Jeez. Yes! Banked it. All right. I have the pleasure of having my nephew and niece visiting. He is my brother's eldest son, and he put this booklet together some time ago in the last year and gave this to me, I don't know, months and months ago. I read it and was so blown away by it. And it's called Over There, with the American Expeditionary Forces in France during the Great War. And this is a passion of his. He's an archivist at the William Clements Library, which is at the University of Michigan. And this was to honor the centennial anniversary of the armistice that ended World War I, right? Which was November 11, 1918. And I started talking with him again yesterday about this stuff, and it is fascinating to me. So I am going to ask Louis Miller. Do they call you Louis at work or Louis? Both. Okay. Because I want you to hear some of this. Here, you got to come real close to me, bud. And if I can't take call, I could take emails. Okay. This is Lou. I call him Louis.
Hello, everyone.
Hi. Boy, I'm glad you're here, because I sort of ran out of crap anyway.
Well, good. It works for both of us then.
And I don't have my level of outrage is, by virtue of my being exhausted, just not quite up to the standards I usually require to do the show. I almost don't know where to start. This is such an extraordinary thing right here. You say 2 million men and women, mm-hmm. and I want to get to that too, mm-hmm. Served in France in World War I. 2 million. We didn't get in to that war until it was almost over. Isn't that, when did we get in?
April of 1917.
We got in April of 1917, and it ended in November. Okay.
And even though we got in April 1917, the vast majority of American troops that were in France and saw combat didn't arrive until the summer of 1918. It took America a really long time to actually get geared up for the war. Surprise, surprise, it seems like it's a common theme. And even by the end of the war, we're still relying almost entirely on French artillery, French planes. The American Army never got up to its full fighting capacity in the First World War.
I would imagine that had something to do with the fact that the American citizenry did not want, and the Congress did not want to get involved.
There was a big debate in America about this early on in the war, where you had kind of wealthy Anglophiles advocating for the war, because actually a lot of these rich businessmen, such as J.P. Morgan, had interest in the Allies, the British, French, and Russians, winning. Because they were the ones that were... It was
hurting their business.
Yes, and they were supplying the munitions to these countries.
Okay,
so if they couldn't collect at the end of the war, they weren't going to get any of their money back. So at a certain point, really, actually from the very beginning of the war, it was almost inevitable that America would get involved eventually.
Yeah. Wilson wanted us in, the president, didn't he?
He ran for his second term, actually saying that he had kept us out of the war and that he planned to keep on doing it. There's multiple reasons why that it actually forced our hand. One of them is the Germans reopening their submarine warfare against American ships, on which they had stopped after the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. they started that back up again in 1917. There was also the intercepted message by British intelligence, the Zimmermann telegram, that showed that Germany was reaching out to Mexico to offer, if they joined the war on Germany's side, they would provide assistance, and if Mexico could invade the southern U.S., that was their proposition.
That's weird because they're doing it now.
Yep.
Took them a while. Talk about taking a while to gear up. Donald Trump will tell you they're doing it now.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't want to, because this is, okay, so, wait. I'm going to be all over the place here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Men and women. I want you to talk a little bit about it. Women were not in the military, so how many American women were?
So, of the 2 million in France, about 16,500 of them were women. So not, a large percentage, but they served
What were they doing?
Nurses.
Okay.
A lot of them also serving with the YMCA and other kind of welfare organizations.
Red Cross.
Yes, Red Cross.
Well, they were Red Cross, right.
Knights of Columbus, Jewish Welfare Board. But I think mostly with the YMCA, they were donut girls, coffee girls, given these sort of, and expected to smile and keep all the soldiers happy. So a lot of it was kind of applying this kind of concept of women as these maternal beings that, these soldiers are away from home, from their mothers. They need women there to keep up their morale. Mm-hmm. But women also performed very...
but in those times, I'm thinking, who are the women
that went over?
That went over. What kind? Because that was so out of, the realm of what it was perceived of a woman, a respectable woman would do. Lots
of college graduates. Mm-hmm. Actually older than what you'd think. It wasn't like, I remember reading a book. It wasn't like the average age was early 20s. I think it was more like early 30s. Some married women as well.
Wow.
The most interesting, there's all of it's interesting, but there was a group of about 300 women that were known as the Hello Girls in the service in the American Expeditionary Forces. And their job was signal board telephone operating. Because at the time, that was actually viewed that women were better at that than men, and that women filled most of the jobs of these switchboard operators. Uh-huh. So the Clements Library, where I work, has a few letters and a photograph related to a woman that served there, Grace Banker of New Jersey. She was a Barnard College graduate in 1916, but then became a telephone switchboard operator. And during the war, the American Army issued a call for women that were experienced as switchboard operators, but also were fluent in French to serve overseas. So she served overseas. They wore helmets. I mean, they were close enough to the front lines that, they had shells landing near them. The U.S. government did not recognize them as veterans until 1979, when only some, I think 18 women of the original, 200 plus were still alive.
Wow.
Yes. I think the legacy of World War I and all of our conflicts in this country are more that once the fighting stops, we stop supporting anything to do with the men and women that served. I think you see that now, and you definitely see it in the First World War.
There's another little footnote here, because this pamphlet, it's amazing. It contains it's excerpts from letters that these young American men, once they joined up and got over there, wrote home, right?
Yep.
These letters are just amazing. But you point out right on page 1, unfortunately, this pamphlet contains none of the written words of the approximately 180,000 African Americans who served in France. Why?
So this is like the part of the First World War that I think is maybe why in the Second World War that we don't address the segregation of the armed forces. Unlike white troops in France, I think over 50% of them were classified as combatants. Only less than 20% of black troops were classified as such, because the southern states were so against arming black soldiers that you have all these southern senators saying you can't do it. You won't, and part of this is based in a riot, rebellion, whatever you want to call it, in 1917, known as the Houston riot, where black soldiers of the regular army, because there were segregated units of the regular army known as the Buffalo Soldiers. Some of them were in Houston, Texas, were assaulted by white cops, a couple of them almost beaten to death. And this is then what caused some of the black soldiers to kind of revolt. They shot some people, including a white officer who was down there. So a ton of them were put on trial, and I think, over a dozen were hung afterwards as well. But so this then summed up the kind of claims that the white Southerners were making, that you couldn't arm black soldiers; it would lead to race war.
Wow.
They sent home the black troops from France first, not to be nice, but because they were worried that the black troops being around white French women who didn't have the same sort of cultural
racism.
Yeah. That would make them too friendly with white women in the States. Black soldiers returning home were lynched, forced to strip off their uniforms at the station when they arrived, even if that was the only clothing they had on their back. It's truly horrific. The most of them were treated as laborers, just like they had been in the American Civil War and the Spanish-American
and World War II.
Yep. Yep. So they were. I mean, there's even claims by some of the leading black intellectuals at the time that, they're true, that black soldiers in the States are being forced to live in these huts where there's no heating, they're dying of the cold. Basically, they're wearing Civil War uniforms still, 50 years later, because they're not seen as soldiers in the same way. So what's so interesting about this conflict is African Americans formed a significant part of the American Expeditionary Forces, but they weren't given the same roles. Even the black combat units that we think of, the Harlem Hellfighters, are very well known, that from the 93rd Division, they mostly saw action with the French almost entirely, because the French and British, of course, when the American troops were actually in France, Germany almost won the war close to the end of the war in March of 1918. They needed American soldiers, but America, rightly, I think, recognized that if they allowed their troops into the hands of other countries, then when they were at the negotiating table at the end of the war, they wouldn't have the same sort of say in what happened. So Pershing, the general of the American Expeditionary Forces, refused to allow most American troops to be put with other. He wanted an American army in the field.
He didn't want them mixing with any of the other.
But with the black soldiers, it was fine. They did that with the 93rd Division. Yep.
Okay. Now, we could talk for a million hours. Tell me now, because I want to end up reading one of these accounts from Connor. What's his name? DeMint.
Yes,
Yeah.
Colin DeMint.
Colin DeMint. Tell again, what was the designation of his job over there? This is a guy who was 40 years old. He tried to enlist as a soldier. He was too old, or
it's just I think he worked in the army as sort of a more kind of intellectual position, an administrative position in Washington D.C.
He was at the time professor at
University of Washington.
University of Washington. And this guy, what were they called? The job he did?
Searchers, Red Cross searchers.
And there were how many of these searchers?
It's not clear. This is actually something that I'm working on right now, and hopefully, a decade or two from now, we'll have a book out about. I think at this point I have about 60-some names of people that served in this capacity for the Americans.
Okay. Serving for, you're telling me what, the Red Cross?
This is where it gets so convoluted.
But their job was a searcher over in France during what was the job?
So for the most part, it seems like they were based in hospitals where they would talk to wounded soldiers, try to determine, not only what had happened to them so that they could tell their family that they were either okay or were seriously wounded, but also trying to figure out what had happened to the men in their unit that had been killed so that they could write to the families of those people as well. Mostly women served in these capacities. Again, talking about women in France, of the 60-some names, I think well over 90% of them are women. So Colin DeMint serving in this role kind of begs some questions. Yes, it seems to go against the pattern.
But this is a man who was a journalism professor.
Yes.
And so these searchers would end up writing letters back to families of soldiers killed in action and maybe wounded in action. And where's that one?
Oh, yeah,
that
here, I'll
Clement,
find it
I
for
want to.
you. Well, and just, so everybody knows too, it's not even, that was it seems like that was just an expectation of if you were a lieutenant and the men under you died, you wrote to their parents. The chaplain of the regiment was often like kind of the unofficial, they were expected to do that for everybody, but in the soldiers that I've studied and who were killed, you will see letters from soldiers who maybe only came across them once, but saw them when they died or saw when they got wounded and felt compelled to try to track down the parents to write to them. So it seems like a very common sort of, I think it's that one though.
Right. So this is one that this Colin Dement wrote to the parents of Elvin O. Olson of the 361st Infantry. And I'm going to read, do you mind if I read it?
No, go ahead.
I'm going to read this to you. So a mother, Elvin Olson's mom, who was probably back in Wisconsin. He was born in Avon, Wisconsin, it says here. Elvin Oscar Olson was born in 1889, and he was killed in France in the war. And here is the letter. This is the letter, part of the letter his mother got.
Yep.
Written by one of these searchers, one in particular that Louis is doing more research on, because the man. Because of his cheery disposition, Private Elvin O. Olson was known in Company 1 as Sunshine. He and Sergeant Howard White, who in civil life is a professor of economic zoology at the Oregon Agricultural College, Corvallis, Oregon, were runners together in Company 1. He's writing this to the guy's mother. No?
Well, it's what we have at the Clements Library are retained copies of what I have a few examples to show that he did write these in letters as well. So he had them published in the newspaper, but he also wrote each individual family.
I see. So he so clearly writes as a journalist. And so already we know of this young guy who's now dead that he's writing about, that he must have been so special that everybody called him Sunshine. And now we're told his friend Howard was a professor. How does a professor end up over in, is that, I guess people, okay.
The expectations, and this was this was a regiment that was made up of
They were drafted,
yep,
so
this
they
was drafted.
So, on the night of September 30th, in the first phase of the Argonne Drive, Sergeant White had been sent up to get someone to accompany him on a mission and got Sunshine Olson. That night they dug in together, and thereafter until Olson was killed, the two slept together and were seldom apart. He was the most willing man I was with on the front, said Sergeant White. He wanted to do more than his share and to take more than his part of the danger. He had worked out for himself the best mental condition I have seen in a man. He surely was fine, and he helped put me on my feet in every way. One night, I think it was October 2nd or 3rd, the Germans were putting down a heavy barrage, and during that barrage, mid the shells, we talked. Sunshine made some such statement as this: I don't believe in being foolhardy and throwing myself into unnecessary danger, but when the shell that is for me comes, I'm going to take it. This, again, they're quoting the guy who was with him. He slept every night with his helmet tilted over his head and thought it foolish that I didn't do so always. His idea was to evade disfigurement if he were hit. This illustrated the fine care he took of himself, although he was without fear. 2 nights before he was killed, I had been up all night, and he refused next day to let me do anything. This was October 8. On the morning of October 9, we started out at 8 a.m. in the smoke barrage thrown by our thermite batteries. We went side by side. We stopped at the battalion PC. He was in fine spirits, as he always was, being sunshine. The battalion PC took up a position below a hill, and I was sent to get Company 1 together. Private Olson stepped over into the woods with some other men to take cover. Perhaps it would have been better if he had stayed below the bank. Bullets from machine guns from Hill 255 were raking the woods. He was hit while standing. The bullet struck his head. He had said, according to another runner who was close by him, "I'm going back." But a moment later he was hit and fell dead. One of the hardest things I had to do was to pass his body. The care taken to get such an extraordinarily specific account of one dead soldier. And this is the kind of work that this searcher did over and over again. And some of the accounts, the dying words of these guys were in their they were younger than you.
Yeah.
They were in their early 20s, in their teens, some of them.
Many of them immigrants who could barely speak English.
And the one guy who was hit who said, "Take my mother," he was carrying a picture of his mother. And he said to somebody,
"I'd like for you to," I think something like, "I'd like to send it back to her, but it's so stained with blood, never mind."
He took it out. He said, "Send this picture to my mother." He looks at it, and it's covered in his blood. And he says, "Never mind." And all of that gets recorded.
And then published in the major West Coast newspapers in the spring of 1919. So not only is Dement writing to the families and giving them personal letters about each one of their loved ones that was killed, but then he publishes it in the well-known newspapers in Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington, to kind of reach a wider audience. I'm not sure exactly what Dement's motivations were, and I hope to find out more the more I do research on him, because it is such a fascinating example of kind of memorialization and mourning and an attempt to bring closure to thousands of people's families.
This really is, you did see that amazing
Peter Jackson documentary?
Yes.
Yes.
What was that called?
They Shall Not Grow Old.
They Shall Not Grow Old. I think I've talked about it on here, where they used this archival footage of fighting and colorized some of it and whatever. But what's your takeaway from that? I mean, you were telling me last night that most of the Americans who died in this war died, in the last?
6 weeks of the war.
The last 6 weeks. We were throwing these young men's bodies at the Germans.
Yep. And
cannon fodder.
And doing it in a way that even horrified our allies. So the American tactics were out of date, and we refused to really listen to the French and British to the extent that we should have. I guess no surprises there. We thought we could do it better than they could. But it just meant head-on charges often into machine gun nests that led to unnecessarily high casualties among American forces. So you have correspondents from the British and French that are serving and saying, we feel bad for the Americans, but so many of these deaths could have been avoided if they had listened to us.
And a lot of these guys died of the influenza too. Was that a big part of it?
Yeah, so more deaths occurred with the Americans because of influenza than because of battlefield deaths.
Really?
Of the 116,000 dead, I believe about 52,000 were killed in battle, with the rest mostly dying of influenza. But this is where influenza could be made worse because of previously being gassed by the chemical weapons being used on the front. So it's hard to really combine, what was a war casualty and what wasn't. The influenza would have been dwarfed by the number of battlefield deaths if the war had stretched into 1919, which most of the Allies just thought was a fact. And America would have picked up the slack from the British and French, and we would have seen catastrophic amounts of casualties in that war. So we are very lucky as Americans that it ended when we did.
So what happened in those last 6 weeks that the Germans finally...
There was enough of a breakthrough, and I think also breakdown in morale among German soldiers. But also, and this is where World War II colors, our interpretation of it, but they never got beat in the way they should have. They invaded France. They then get pushed back. We never fought them into Germany. We occupied the Rhineland area after the war until I think 23 or 24.
And then
with the
gave it
Allies.
back.
Yeah, but this should have been something that the Germans really should have been fought all the way to
But
Berlin.
I thought with but I thought we did. I mean, Germans were so humiliated by the defeat, and then there was this horrible inflation and all that stuff that allowed Hitler.
Well, it was because the German public never really saw that they had been beat as bad as they had. That the war had never come to their doorstep in the way that it did in the Second World War.
It wasn't. That war was not.
That was in
fought
Eastern France and Belgium.
It was not fought in Germany.
No.
That war.
No, not at all. Unless you're counting Alsace and Lorraine, which that isn't really their territory. But yep.
So it was a true war of German aggression fought in France and Belgium.
And I think It's you can't turn the Germans into their Second World War iteration where they are truly just evil, but still they did invade. They invaded a country that was an enemy of theirs, but they totally Belgium wasn't. Belgium was neutral. That's why the British got involved at all. So the Germans thought they could end the war in like a matter of weeks. They were already printing medals showing the capture of Paris. Because you forget that the last
Why
war...
are the French always considered to be so easy to roll over?
And in this war, it's the one time where...
They didn't.
So keep in mind that, the Americans suffered, 52,000 deaths in their time, fighting. In one day in August of 1914, the French army had 27,000 dead.
Good God.
More than any British. It just doesn't live in French memory the way it does in British memory, which is why you see the Peter Jackson documentary, because the French have to grapple with Vichy France and the Second World War, whereas the British...
that war wiped out an entire generation of young British men. And
that was only half of... The French suffered twice as many killed. So, I think 1.4 million French killed. And over 4 million
For
wounded.
what?
Yep.
What the hell was it about?
You can argue about it all you want.
Did these guys ever talk about that in their letters? Did they have a clue what they were fighting for?
They think it's German aggression and making to make the world safe for democracy. They really did think that they were fighting for just as noble of a cause as World War II soldiers saw it.
Well, I'm glad they thought that they were dying for a...
Even though we've forgotten it completely. I mean, it's a war that's just forgotten in American historical memory.
Well, and I don't know that I ever really learned that much about it. I know Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
And you grew up around vets. I mean, that's what's so sad is that, like, when you were a kid, these were the older guys.
They were. My
But
grandfather was a doughboy.
And luckily was still in the States, I think, when the war ended.
So he never got
Because
over.
otherwise he would have been sent over there and...
Been cannon fodder, and I wouldn't exist.
Yep.
And you wouldn't exist.
So thank God it ended when it did.
Wow. Well, okay. I'm glad you were here today because I find this fascinating, and I know my audience, being the smart fellows they are, would be interested in this. So, boy, the more you know of American history, the more...
But it's so important to learn. I mean, I think it's why I love my job, is because you learn all these forgotten episodes of American history that show how much has changed and how little has changed. And I think that's really important. I think the fact that we aren't teaching history in K-12 education is terrible for this country.
They're still teaching history.
I mean, I didn't get anything. I didn't get anything in public education, and now and then I went to college and became a total nut about all
this
types of
stuff
history
that you hadn't.
Yep, because I just don't teach it.
Okay, well, a little something different, but I just find it fascinating. Thank you, Louis.
No, thank you.
And I'll be back tomorrow, and I guess we'll go back to wringing our hands and tearing our hair out about our current situation. History, at least, is behind us, but the current situation, have a good day. Stay dry.
Lynn Cullen Live, Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. and archived at pghcitypaper.com. The opinions expressed on Lynn Cullen Live are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the viewpoints of Pittsburgh City Paper or its advertisers.